10:00 p.m. The grand ballroom of the Thorne estate. The music had stopped, replaced by the suffocating silence of 300 billionaires waiting for a massacre. Victoria Sterling smirked, her icy blue eyes gleaming with venom as she held up a crisp cashier's check under the blinding chandelier light. "If you can play this better than me, I'll give you 10-0. The billionaire's fiancée sneered, her cruel voice echoing through the hall. "But if you can't, you are fired without pay, and your crippled little brother will be thrown out onto the freezing street by morning." The elite crowd chuckled softly. But Clara Vance didn't cry. Instead, with a terrifying, unyielding calm, the maid slowly untied her faded gray apron. Her bloody, bandaged hands hovered over the pristine keys of the $200,000 Steinway piano. Before she struck the first chord, Clara looked past the cruel heiress, locking her dark, defiant eyes directly with Dominic Thorne, the most feared mafia boss in the city, who was watching her from the shadows with a suddenly fractured heart. How did a desperate, broken servant use a single melody to bring a ruthless underworld empire to its knees? Hit that subscribe button and listen closely, because the ultimate revenge is about to begin. If you can play this better than me, I'll give you $10,000. The billionaire's fiancée would soon smirk as she delivered those words to the maid holding a silver tray, fully expecting the young woman to break down and cry in front of the elite crowd. Victoria Sterling would stand there, draped in haute couture and dripping in inherited diamonds, confident that she had cornered a helpless, uneducated servant. What Victoria did not know, what no one in that glittering, terrifying mansion knew, was that the quiet girl in the faded gray uniform was a former Juilliard prodigy. Clara Vance had once been destined for the grandest stages of the world, her hands insured for fortunes, her name whispered with reverence by the greatest living conductors. But life had a cruel way of rewriting symphonies into tragedies. For now, that glittering confrontation was still weeks away. Today, reality was a bitter, freezing morning at the Thorne estate. A sprawling architectural monolith perched on the edge of a jagged cliffside. The estate was a fortress of dark stone, frosted glass, and impenetrable security. Clara Vance woke at 4 a.m. to the sharp, biting cold of the servants' quarters in the basement. She did not need an alarm clock. The rhythm of survival had long since been permanently etched into her bones. Her body ached with the residual exhaustion of yesterday's 16-hour shift, every muscle protesting as she pushed herself up from the narrow, lumpy mattress. She dressed in silence, slipping into the drab gray uniform that stripped away her identity, rendering her effectively invisible. She tied her dark hair back into a tight, practical knot, making sure not a single strand was out of place. In this house, perfection was not requested. It was a mandatory condition for breathing the same air as the masters. As she moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, Clara's mind drifted to the only thing that kept her moving forward, her 12-year-old brother. Leo, the image of his bright, hopeful eyes and the metallic gleam of his wheelchair anchored her. She had sacrificed everything, her scholarship, her music, her entire future, to keep him safe after their mother passed away. Every scrubbed floor, every polished window, and every swallowed insult was a down payment on Leo's life. The Thorne estate was not a normal mansion, and its inhabitants were not normal billionaires. The air inside the house always felt thick, heavy with unspoken threats and unimaginable wealth. As Clara quietly polished the mahogany banisters of the grand staircase, she noted the silent, broad-shouldered men in tailored black suits standing near the exits. They were not mere security guards. They were soldiers. You could see it in the way their eyes scanned the perimeter, in the subtle, heavy bulges beneath their suit jackets. This was the empire of Dominic Thorne. Dominic was a man whose reputation preceded him in whispers that people were too terrified to speak aloud. He was the undisputed king of the city's underworld, a mafia boss who operated with corporate precision and ruthless, terrifying silence. Clara had only seen him a handful of times since she started working at the estate, But his presence was something that seeped into the very foundation of the house. When Dominic entered a room, the temperature seemed to drop. He never yelled. He never had to. Later that morning, Clara was assigned to serve breakfast in the sunroom, the heavy scent of dark roasted coffee, cedarwood, and the lingering trace of a Cuban cigar signaled that the master of the house was present. Dominic sat at the head of the long glass table, staring at a tablet. He wore a crisp, dark dress shirt. The sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faintly marked by faded scars. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone. Then came the sharp, unmistakable click-clack of stiletto heels striking the marble floor. Victoria Sterling breezed into the room. She was breathtakingly beautiful in a manufactured, razor-sharp way, with platinum blonde hair and eyes like chipped ice. She was the daughter of a prominent political family, a strategic alliance for Dominic's empire. From the moment Victoria had moved into the estate, she had made it her personal mission to remind every member of the staff exactly where they belonged on the food chain. Clara approached the table, keeping her eyes cast downward in standard deference, carrying a heavy silver tray laden with fresh pastries and espresso. As she carefully leaned in to place Victoria's cup on the table, Victoria deliberately shifted her elbow, knocking hard into Clara's wrist. The dark espresso sloshed over the rim of the porcelain cup, spilling directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Victoria snapped, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Are you entirely blind, or just incredibly stupid? You've ruined the linen." Clara immediately stepped back, bowing her head. "I apologize. Miss Sterling, I will clean it up at once." "You're clumsy," Victoria continued, leaning back in her chair and eyeing Clara with open disgust. "It's honestly pathetic how hard it is to find competent help. You people walk around in a daze, completely useless. Clean it up, and then go scrub the terrace. I don't want to look at you anymore." Clara did not flinch. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded, her face a mask of practiced stoicism. She wiped up the spill with practiced efficiency. But as she reached across the table, she felt the weight of a gaze upon her. She glanced up for a fraction of a second. Dominic Thorne had lowered his tablet. His piercing gray eyes were fixed directly on Clara. There was no pity in his stare, nor was there anger. It was a calculating, intense observation, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Clara quickly averted her eyes, picked up her tray, and retreated to the shadows. By midnight, the estate was cloaked in heavy silence. Clara's shift had officially ended hours ago, but the grueling demands of the head housekeeper had kept her working late. She found herself alone in the vast, cavernous grand ballroom. The only light came from the moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, silver shadows across the polished stone floor. In the center of the room stood the crown jewel of the estate, a breathtaking, custom-made Steinway grand piano, its glossy black wood gleaming in the dark. Clara approached it slowly, the cleaning cloth in her hand suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. She had spent the last 2 years avoiding instruments, locking away the music inside her, because the grief of losing that life was too profound to bear. But tonight, the bone-deep exhaustion and the sting of Victoria's daily humiliations had worn her defenses dangerously thin. She reached out, her calloused, blistered fingers hovering just millimeters above the pristine white ivory keys. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, she wasn't a maid in a mafia boss's house. She was Clara Vance, stepping onto a stage, the orchestra tuning behind her, the world waiting for her to breathe life into the silence. She could hear the music in her mind, a symphony of aching, desperate beauty. Her finger lightly pressed down on a single key. A soft, fragile note rang out, echoing hauntingly through the empty ballroom. Suddenly, a shadow shifted in the dark archway of the hall. Clara gasped, snatching her hand back as if the piano had burned her. She spun around, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Clutching the cleaning rag to her chest, she peered into the darkness. terrified that Victoria or the head housekeeper had caught her, but the hallway remained silent. Whoever or whatever had been standing there was gone. Clara swallowed hard, wiped down the piano lid with trembling hands, and fled the room, unaware that the melody of that single note had just altered the course of her entire life. How much is a human life worth? It is a question philosophers and poets have debated for centuries, wrapping the answer in abstract concepts of soul, potential, and divine purpose. But for Clara Vance, standing in the cramped, sterile-smelling laundry room of the Thorne estate, the value of a human life was not a philosophical debate. It was a cold, hard, merciless number: $45,000. The vibration of the cheap prepaid cell phone in her apron pocket had startled her amidst the hum of the massive washing machines. When she answered, the clinical, exhausted voice of Dr. Eris from the city's underfunded public hospital delivered the blow that brought Clara to her knees. "Clara, it's about Leo," the doctor had said, his words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "His spinal curvature has accelerated much faster than our initial projections. The pressure on his lower vertebrae is critical. If we don't perform the stabilization surgery within the next 3 weeks, the nerve damage will be irreversible. He will lose all function below the waist." Permanently, Clara had stopped breathing. The damp towel she had been holding slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the linoleum floor. But the surgery was scheduled for next year. She stammered, her voice cracking, a desperate plea for the universe to rewind time. "I have a payment plan. I'm saving everything I have. I just need more time. I'm so sorry." "Clara, the timeline has vanished. And because this is now classified as an emergency high-risk procedure, requiring a specialized neurological team, the hospital board requires the funds up front, $45,000. If you can't secure the money, we have to discharge him and transition him to palliative pain management." The phone line had gone dead, leaving Clara alone with the deafening roar of the washing machines. She slid down the cold-tiled wall, pulling her knees to her chest, and let out a silent, ragged sob. $45,000. To the people upstairs. To Dominic Thorne and Victoria Sterling. That was the price of a handbag. It was the cost of a few bottles of vintage champagne popped open on a Tuesday night. But to Clara, it was an insurmountable mountain, an impossible ransom for her brother's legs. Panic, dark and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She could not let Leo lose what little mobility he had left. He was only 12. He loved painting. He loved the outdoors. He dreamed of one day walking on a beach. She had promised their dying mother that she would protect him, that she would carry the weight of the world, so he wouldn't have to. Clara wiped her face fiercely with the back of her sleeves. There was no room for pride anymore. Pride was a luxury for the rich. She had to swallow her dignity, crush it into dust, and do whatever it took. 30 minutes later, Clara found herself standing outside the opulent double doors of the master dressing room. She took a deep, shuddering breath and knocked. Enter came Victoria's sharp, melodious voice. Clara stepped into a room that looked like a high-end boutique. Silk gowns hung in color-coordinated rows, and the vanity was cluttered with crystal perfume bottles and diamond jewelry. Victoria sat before a massive gilded mirror, casually filing her manicured nails while a stylist worked on her hair. "What is it?" Victoria asked, not bothering to look away from her own reflection. "I didn't call for a maid." "Miss Sterling," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it steady. "I need to ask you for a favor." Victoria paused her nail file. She turned her head slowly, a cold, amused smile playing on her lips. "A favor, you. How quaint. Go on, entertain me." "My younger brother is very sick," Clara said, staring at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug to avoid Victoria's predatory gaze. "He needs an emergency surgery. And I am desperate. I am begging for extra shifts. I will work nights. Weekends I will do the jobs no one else wants to do. I will work 20 hours a day if you will just allow me the overtime pay, or perhaps a small advance on my wages." Victoria stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then she let out a soft, mocking laugh and advance. Do I look like a charity organization to you? You people are always the same, always coming with your hands out, with some sob story about a sick relative, expecting a handout just because you exist. Clara bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. I am not asking for a handout, Miss Sterling. I am asking to work for it. I will do absolutely anything. Victoria's eyes narrowed. The malicious glint in them sharpened into something truly cruel. She saw an opportunity. Not to help, but to break a spirit that had irritated her for months. Claire's quiet dignity had always felt like a silent rebellion to Victoria. Now she had the girl exactly where she wanted her. Anything, Victoria repeated softly. She stood up, walking slowly around Clara like a shark circling wounded prey. She looked out the large window. Outside, a brute winter storm was raging. The temperature had plummeted below freezing, and the massive stone driveway of the estate was covered in a thick, treacherous layer of black ice and packed snow. The driveway looks dreadful, Victoria mused, crossing her arms. The salt trucks won't arrive until tomorrow. And we have important guests arriving for dinner tonight. The men Dominic hired to clear it are far too slow. Victoria turned back to Clara, her smile venomous. You want extra pay? Fine. I will pay you triple your hourly rate for the day. But you will clear the ice from the main entrance to the grand gates. And you won't use a shovel. You will use a hand scraper and a wire brush. I want the stones pristine. If you miss a single spot, you don't get paid at all. It was a task meant for industrial machinery. Not a single woman on her hands and knees in the freezing cold. It was designed to humiliate, to torture, to force Clara to quit. I will do it, Clara said instantly, her voice deadened of all emotion. Within 10 minutes, Clara was outside. The wind howled like a wounded animal, slicing through the thin fabric of her gray coat. She dropped to her knees on the frozen cobblestones. A heavy wire brush in her bare hands, Victoria had expressly forbidden her from wearing gloves. Claiming they would ruin her grip, Clara began to scrub. The ice was stubborn, cemented to the stone, with every furious scrape. The jagged edges of the ice tore at the delicate skin of her knuckles. The cold was so intense it burned, turning her fingers numb, then sending shooting, agonizing spikes of pain up her arms. But she didn't stop. With every agonizing motion, she whispered a mantra in her mind. For Leo, 45,000. For Leo, 45,000. Hours bled into one another. Her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding, leaving faint, rusty streaks of red on the white snow. Her knees were bruised and throbbing against the unforgiving stone. Yet she kept moving, a mechanical entity driven purely by maternal love for her brother. By late afternoon, the pain had become a blinding white noise in her head. She desperately needed hot water to thaw her hands before she lost the ability to move her fingers entirely. Slipping through the servants' side entrance, she bypassed the main kitchens and navigated the dark, subterranean labyrinth of the estate's basement to find the utility sinks. The basement of the Thorne estate was a place the staff generally avoided. It was a vast network of storage rooms, wine cellars, and heavy steel doors that required biometric clearance. As Clara hurried down the dim, concrete corridor, cradling her bleeding hands against her chest, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a heavy, sickening thud, the sound of bone cracking under immense pressure, followed by a muffled, agonizing groan. Clara froze. The noise had come from a heavy iron door that had been left slightly ajar at the end of the hall. Every survival instinct screamed at her to turn around and run, but she was paralyzed by sheer terror. Slowly, uncontrollably, she took a step closer, peering through the 2-inch gap between the door and the frame. The room was poorly lit, illuminated only by a single, harsh overhead bulb. In the center of the room, a man was tied to a heavy steel chair. He was bloodied, his face a bruised, unrecognizable mess. Standing over him were 3 of the massive men in black suits Clara recognized from the upper floors. But it was the man standing in the shadows. leaning casually against the concrete wall that made her breath catch in her throat. Dominic Thorne. He was smoking a cigar, the red ember glowing in the dim light like a demon's eye. He looked entirely relaxed, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying control. He didn't look like a businessman today. He looked like the apex predator of the criminal underworld. I don't like repeating myself. Dominic's voice drifted through the crack in the door. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was smooth, dark and colder than the ice Clara had just been scrubbing. Where is the shipment? Marco, the Tide Man sobbed, spitting blood onto the floor. I swear to God. Mr. Thorne, I don't know. They ambushed us. Dominic took a slow drag of his cigar. He exhaled a plume of thick white smoke. He gave a microscopic nod to one of the men in suits. The man stepped forward, raising a heavy metal wrench. Clara clamped a bleeding hand over her own mouth to stifle a gasp. She stumbled backward, her heel scraping loudly against the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the silent hallway like a gunshot. Inside the room, the movement stopped. The heavy, terrifying silence descended. Clara was trapped. She backed away, her heart hammering so violently, she thought her chest would crack open. Through the gap in the door, Dominic slowly turned his head. His piercing, glacial gray eyes locked directly onto the sliver of space where Clara was standing. For one terrifying, infinite second, time stopped. Clara stared into the eyes of a man who could end her life with a single whispered command. He saw her gray uniform. He saw her terrified, wide eyes. He saw the blood dripping from her raw hands. Clara did the only thing she could do to survive. She lowered her head, breaking eye contact, showing absolute submission. She turned and walked away. She did not run. Running meant she was a threat, a liability fleeing a crime scene. She walked with deliberate stepped back toward the servants' stairs, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening. No one followed her. No alarms were raised. When she finally burst back out into the freezing winter air, returning to the cruel, icy driveway, she sat onto her bruised knees. The freezing wind whipped around her, stinging her raw face. She looked down at her ruined, bloody hands. She had survived a brush with the mafia boss, but she was still trapped in the clutches of his fiancée. She picked up the heavy wire brush. Her tears froze on her cheeks as she began to scrape the ice once more. She was a ghost in a house of monsters, invisible and insignificant. But as the dark sky closed in over the Thorne estate, Clara Vance knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would let them break her body. She would let them freeze her bones. But she would never let them take her brother's life. The human body possesses a miraculous, almost terrifying capacity to endure suffering. It can adapt to blistering heat. It can survive the crushing depths of the ocean. And it can push through the agonizing, bone-deep ache of freezing temperatures. But the human spirit is a much more fragile instrument. It runs on a different kind of fuel, one that cannot be measured in calories or oxygen. It runs on hope. And in the Thorne estate, hope was a heavily rationed commodity, kept under lock and key by the people who owned the world. Clara Vance sat on the edge of her narrow, sunken mattress in the basement servants' quarters, staring blankly at her ruined hands. The morning light filtering through the tiny, ground-level window was gray and unforgiving, casting a sickly pallor over the tiny room. Her fingers were heavily wrapped in pristine white gauze, the stark color contrasting violently with the dark, bruised flesh visible at her wrists. The pain was no longer a sharp, stabbing sensation. It had settled into a deep, rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She had spent 14 hours on the freezing cobblestones the previous day, scraping black ice until her muscles had seized and her vision had blurred with exhaustion. She had done it for the promise of triple overtime pay. A desperate, clawing attempt to chip away at the impossible $45,000 mountain, standing between her brother and a lifetime of paralysis. A soft knock on the wooden door pulled her from her silent reverie. Before she could attempt to stand, the door clicked open, and Thomas, the estate's elderly head butler, slipped into the room. Thomas was a man composed of rigid posture, tailored waistcoats, and decades of guarded secrets. He had served the Thorne family since Dominic was a child, navigating the treacherous waters of a mafia empire with the quiet grace of a diplomat. But beneath his starched exterior lay a heart that had not yet been entirely corrupted by the wealth surrounding him. He carried a small silver tray holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea and a fresh bottle of antiseptic ointment. His lined face softened with a profound, paternal sorrow as he looked at Clara's bandaged hands. "You should still be sleeping," Clara, Thomas said softly, setting the tray down on the small wooden crate she used as a nightstand. "The head housekeeper has been informed that you are strictly off duty for the next 48 hours. By my direct order." Clara shook her head, a sudden jolt of panic piercing through her exhaustion. "No, Thomas. Please, I can't afford to lose 2 days of pay. Miss Sterling promised me the overtime for the driveway. I need to be on the floor. I can polish the silver. I can do the laundry. I just can't stop working." Thomas let out a heavy, tired sigh, pulling up a rickety wooden chair to sit beside her bed. "Child, if you push yourself any further, you will collapse. And if you collapse, who will be there to take care of Leo? You are running a marathon on 2 broken legs. You must pause to breathe. Breathing costs money," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as the emotional dam finally began to fracture. The tears she had held back out on the ice now welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. "The hospital called yesterday. Leo's spine is deteriorating faster than they thought. They need $45,000 upfront for an emergency surgery, or he loses his legs forever." I scraped that ice until I bled. "Thomas and I calculate it only earned me a few $100s. It's not enough. It's never going to be enough. The math doesn't work. The world doesn't work for people like us." Thomas remained silent, his gray eyes watching a tear slip down Clara's pale cheek. He had seen many tragedies in his long life working for the underworld elite. He had seen fortunes won and lost in a single night of bloodshed. He had seen politicians bought with briefcases of cash. And he had seen innocent people crushed beneath the wheels of the Thorne Syndicate's ambitions. But there was something about Clara's quiet, enduring agony that struck a chord deep within his chest. He knew about her past. He had seen the Juilliard acceptance letters she kept hidden in a shoebox beneath her bed. He knew the brilliant, radiant future she had sacrificed to keep a roof over her disabled brother's head. "The world is a cruel casino," Clara, Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and rich with solemnity. "The house almost always wins. But occasionally, the dealer decides to look the other way." Clara frowned, confused by his cryptic words. Thomas slowly reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate black suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, navigating through a highly encrypted financial application, before turning the screen toward her. Clara squinted, her tired eyes trying to focus on the digital numbers glowing against the dark interface. It was the estate's payroll and discretionary disbursement system, a network Thomas managed to ensure the vast army of staff was compensated quietly and efficiently. "What is this?" she asked, her breath hitching. "As the head butler of the Thorne estate, I am granted a substantial discretionary fund," Thomas explained, his tone strictly professional, though a faint, rebellious spark danced in his eyes. "It is designated for staff emergencies, hazard pay, and hush money when the master's business requires a swift cleanup. You were exposed to extreme, hazardous conditions yesterday, outside the boundaries of your contractual duties. Furthermore, I have audited your time cards for the past 2 years. The amount of unpaid overtime you have accrued under Miss Sterling's capricious demands is staggering." He pressed a final button. The screen flashed green. "Transfer complete. I have just authorized a hazard and back pay settlement to your designated checking account," Thomas said softly. "Check your phone." Clara, with trembling, bandaged fingers. Clara reached for her cheap prepaid phone resting on the bed. She fumbled with the passcode, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened her banking application. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity, mocking her fragile hope. And then the screen refreshed. Current balance. 45,214.0. Clara stopped breathing. The numbers blurred. Swimming in her vision, she blinked rapidly, terrified that her exhausted mind was projecting a hallucination. But the numbers remained solid, real, beautiful. Thomas, she gasped, the sound tearing from her throat as a mix of a sob and a laugh. Thomas, you can't. If Mr. Thorne finds out, if Miss Sterling sees this. Mr. Thorne does not concern himself with the minutiae of the domestic payroll, Thomas replied smoothly, standing up and brushing a speck of invisible dust from his trousers. And Miss Sterling is far too occupied planning her extravagant gala to notice a clerical adjustment in a ledger she barely understands. The money is legally yours, Clara. It has been processed through the estate's legitimate corporate holding shell. Do not question it. Do not return it. Call the hospital. Save your brother. Clara threw her arms around the old man, burying her face against his tailored jacket, weeping with an intensity that shook her entire frame. It was the first time in years she had cried from pure, unadulterated relief. The impossible mountain had been moved. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest since her mother's funeral was suddenly, miraculously lifted. Thank you, she sobbed, over and over again. Thank you. You saved his life. You saved us. Just take care of your hands. Child, Thomas whispered, gently patting her shoulder before stepping back. And remember to keep your head down. Hope is a beautiful thing, but in this house, it is best kept a secret. The moment the door closed, Clara dialed the hospital. Her hands shook violently as the phone rang. When the receptionist answered, Clara's voice was breathless, practically singing, "This is Clara Vance. I need to speak to Dr. Eris's billing department immediately. I have the funds. I have the $45,000 for Leo Vance's spinal surgery. Please, put him on the schedule. Today. Put him on the schedule right now, for the next 4 hours." Clara lived in a state of euphoric grace. The pain in her hands faded into the background. She imagined walking into Leo's hospital room, holding his hand, and telling him he was going to be okay. She imagined the smell of the ocean, the sound of the waves. The day she would finally push his wheelchair onto the boardwalk and watch him try to stand. It was a false, brilliant ray of sunshine piercing through the dark clouds of her life, blinding her to the predator circling just above. 3 floors above the servants' quarters. In a sprawling office overlooking the frozen valley, Victoria Sterling sat behind a massive desk carved from solid mahogany. The office smelled of expensive leather and Tom Ford perfume. Victoria was dressed in a tailored crimson blazer, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass as she swiped through a sleek tablet. She was currently reviewing the budget for the upcoming Thorne Gala, an event she intended to use to cement her status not just as Dominic's fiancée, but as the undisputed queen of the city's high society. She scrolled past catering costs, floral arrangements, and security retainers. But as she switched tabs to verify the overall estate liquidity, her manicured finger froze. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a tight, displeased line. There was a sudden, massive spike in the domestic payroll ledger. A localized transfer that had occurred mere hours ago. Victoria tapped the screen, drilling down into the financial data with the predatory focus of a woman who despised being out of control. Recipient, Vance Clara, Domestic Staff Tier 3, 00. Authorization, Whitlock, Thomas Head Butler. Classification, hazard pay backdated overtime settlement. Victoria stared at the screen, a cold, venomous rage blooming in her chest. She set her crystal glass down on the desk. The maid, the quiet, infuriatingly stoic maid who had refused to break on the ice yesterday. The maid who had begged for money for a sick brother. Hazard pay. Victoria whispered to the empty room, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across her lips. How remarkably generous of you, Thomas, for Victoria. This was not about the money. $45,000 was equivalent to the diamond tennis bracelet currently resting on her left wrist. It meant absolutely nothing to her bank account, but to her ego, it meant everything. Clara Vance was a peasant. She existed to serve, to suffer, and to remind Victoria of her own inherent superiority. The fact that this insignificant servant had managed to secure a fortune using Thorn money, no less, was an intolerable insult. It was a subversion of the natural order. It meant Clara had found a way to win. Victoria stood up, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she paced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked out at the frozen driveway, the very stones she had forced Clara to scrub with her bare hands. She felt a sickening thrill wash over her. Taking away the money was too simple. Firing Thomas was too messy, as Dominic possessed a rare, bizarre loyalty to the old man. No, she needed to teach the maid a lesson that would echo in her bones for the rest of her miserable life. She needed to let Clara taste the victory, let her swallow it, and then rip it directly out of her stomach. Victoria walked back to the desk and picked up her phone. She didn't call the bank. She didn't call the payroll department to freeze the transfer. Instead, she scrolled through her extensive contact list until she found the name of a man she had met at several elite charity galas, Dr. Harrison Sterling, no blood relation, but a man who owed his entire position as the chief of medicine at the city's public hospital network to the political maneuvering of Victoria's father. She pressed call. It rang twice before being answered with immediate, groveling politeness. Miss Sterling. To what do I owe the absolute pleasure? The chief of medicine chimed, his voice dripping with sycophantic eagerness. Harrison, darling, Victoria purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I find myself in need of a tiny, discreet favor. It involves a patient currently in your pediatric ward. A charity case. Really, a boy named Leo Vance. Leo Vance. Let me pull up the system, the doctor muttered. The clacking of a keyboard echoed over the line. Ah yes, severe spinal curvature. We actually just received a massive, unexpected wire transfer for his emergency surgical procedure. He's being prepped for the surgical roster as we speak. Yes, about that, Victoria said, admiring her flawless manicure. There has been a severe misunderstanding regarding those funds. They were obtained through fraudulent means. Corporate theft, to be exact. The authorities will be involved shortly to seize the assets. Oh, my word, that is terrible. Should I freeze the payment? Don't worry about the money, Harrison. The lawyers will handle that, Victoria commanded, her tone dropping its sweetness, becoming sharp and authoritative. What I need you to do is much simpler. I need you to strike Leo Vance from the surgical roster. Permanently. There was a brief, hesitant pause on the other end of the line. Miss Sterling, the boy's condition is critical. Without the surgery, he will face permanent paralysis. To deny him care when the funds are technically in the hospital's holding account, it could raise ethical flags with the medical board. Victoria's eyes narrowed into slits of pure ice. Let me be abundantly clear. Harrison, my father's syndicate currently funds your entire cardiovascular research wing. If this boy enters an operating room, I will personally see to it that your funding is severed by midnight. I will have my family's auditors tear your administrative budget apart until you are stripped of your license and facing federal embezzlement charges. Do you understand ethical flags now? Doctor, the silence on the line was thick, heavy with the terrifying weight of the mafia-adjacent elite exerting their absolute will over the working class. I understand completely. Miss Sterling, the chief of medicine finally whispered, his voice trembling with defeat. The surgery is cancelled. I will cite a sudden lack of specialized neurological staff and administrative override. Excellent. You've always been so wonderfully cooperative. Harrison. Victoria smiled, the cruelty radiating from her face. Have a lovely afternoon. She ended the call and tossed the phone onto the mahogany desk. She looked at the tablet screen one last time, staring at Clara's name on the payroll ledger. The false ray of hope had just been extinguished, swallowed whole by the endless. Suffocating darkness of the Thorne estate. Victoria walked over to a crystal decanter, poured herself a glass of amber bourbon, and raised it in a silent, mocking toast to the basement below. Enjoy your money, Clara. Victoria whispered to the empty room. It won't buy you a damn thing. The hospital smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the quiet, pervasive scent of despair. It was a scent Clara Vance knew intimately, a sensory anchor that tied her to the worst moments of her life. But as she walked through the sliding glass doors of the pediatric wing that afternoon, the smell didn't bother her, for the first time in years. The hospital did not feel like a waiting room for tragedy. It felt like the threshold to salvation. Clara had used her lunch break to rush across the city. Despite the agonizing pain in her bandaged hands, she held tightly to a plastic bag containing Leo's favorite comic books and a small, slightly crushed box of chocolate pastries she had bought from a street vendor. She was practically vibrating with adrenaline and joy. The $45,000 was resting safely in her account. She had the confirmation email from the billing department. The nightmare was over. She practically ran down the linoleum corridor, dodging nurses pushing medication carts, until she reached room 312. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, a bright, radiant smile breaking across her exhausted face. Leo, I have the most amazing news. Her voice died in her throat. The room was quiet. Leo was sitting up in his hospital bed, his frail body swallowed by the sterile white gown. He wasn't drawing in his sketchbook, nor was he looking out the window. He was staring down at his hands, his small shoulders trembling. Standing beside the bed was Dr. Eris, his face pale and drawn, holding a clipboard with white-knuckled tension. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, suffocating. The radiant hope that had carried Clara across the city evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, dreadful intuition. Dr. Eris, Clara asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She stepped into the room, letting the door click shut behind her. What's going on? They told me Billing received the money. They said he was going on the surgical roster today. Dr. Eris looked up, and the absolute defeat in his eyes made Clara's knees buckle. He looked like a man who had just been forced to execute a puppy. Clara, I am so sorry. I don't understand it myself. I fought them for an hour, but it came directly from the top. Fought who? What are you talking about? Clara demanded, stepping closer to the bed, dropping the plastic bag of comics onto the floor. She reached out with her bandaged hands and grabbed the doctor's white coat. The money is there. I paid the ransom. You said if I got the money, you would fix him. The chief of medicine intervened personally, Doctor. Eris explained, his voice thick with suppressed anger and shame. He couldn't meet Clara's eyes. He issued an administrative override. He cited a sudden reallocation of surgical resources and claimed our neurological team is no longer equipped to handle Leo's specific curvature complication. It's a lie. It's a blatant bureaucratic lie. But he has the ultimate authority. He ordered Leo struck from the surgical roster. Permanently. Clara stared at him, her brain violently rejecting the words. No, that's impossible. You're the surgeon. You can do it. I have the money. Let me talk to the chief of medicine. Let me pay him more. I'll give him all of it. I'll sign a contract. I'll be in debt for the rest of my life. Just take him to the operating room. Clara, please. Dr. Eris whispered, gently prying her bandaged hands from his coat. It's not about the money anymore. The chief threatened to have my license revoked if I even prep Leo for the OR. I am locked out of the system. I have been ordered to begin discharging him tomorrow. They are transitioning him to pain management. Pain management, the clinical, sanitized term for giving up. Clara turned slowly to look at her brother. Leo looked up at her, his large, dark eyes swimming with tears. He was so young, so impossibly small in that sterile bed, and he already understood the cruelty of the world better than most adults. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a tantrum. He just reached out a frail hand and grabbed Clara's sleeve. It's okay, Clara, Leo whispered, his voice cracking. I don't need to walk. I'm okay in the chair. You don't have to cry. That innocent. Brave acceptance broke whatever was left of Clara's heart. She collapsed onto the edge of the bed, pulling her brother into her arms. Burying her face in his thin shoulder, she screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore at her throat. It was the sound of a woman watching her universe burn to the ground, knowing she was utterly powerless to stop the flames. The money was useless. Her grueling labor, the frozen ice, the blood on her hands, it meant nothing. The invisible hands of the elite had reached down from the sky and crushed them like insects, just because they could. 2 hours later, Clara walked back through the towering iron gates of the Thorne estate. She was no longer a human being. She was a ghost operating on muscular memory. Her eyes were hollow, red-rimmed, and devoid of all light. The freezing wind whipped against her face, but she felt absolutely nothing. The world had gone completely numb. She bypassed the grand entrance, slipping down the stone steps into the subterranean servants' quarters. She needed the darkness of her tiny room. She needed to crawl beneath her thin blanket and disappear from the world. But when she pushed open the flimsy wooden door to her room, the darkness she craved was absent. The small overhead bulb was switched on, casting a harsh yellow glare. Sitting on her rickety wooden chair, legs elegantly crossed, was Victoria Sterling. Victoria looked entirely out of place in the dingy basement. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress, holding a lit cigarette between her manicured fingers. The smoke curled lazily toward the low ceiling, mingling with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap damp concrete. Clara froze in the doorway. Her exhausted mind struggled to process why the billionaire's fiancé was sitting in the servants' quarters. "You took your time getting back," Victoria remarked casually, taking a drag from her cigarette. Her icy blue eyes locked onto Clara, sparkling with malicious delight. "I was beginning to think you had run off with Thomas's generous little donation. But then again, where would you go with a crippled boy?" The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. The administrative override. The sudden refusal of the chief of medicine despite the funds. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in her mind, forming a picture so monstrous it defied comprehension. "It was you," Clara whispered, her voice trembling, hollow and ghost-like. "You called the hospital." "I did," Victoria smiled, tapping a long ash onto the concrete floor, deliberately missing the small trash can. "Dr. Harrison Sterling is a very close friend of my father's. A spineless little man, really, but wonderfully obedient when his funding is threatened." Clara took a step forward, her bandaged hands clenching into fists despite the agonizing pain. "Why?" she choked out, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Why would you do that? He is 12 years old. He has nothing to do with you. The money wasn't even yours. It came from the employee fund. Why would you condemn a child to a wheelchair for the rest of his life?" Victoria stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her silk dress. She walked toward Clara, her heels clicking ominously on the concrete. She stopped mere inches from Clara's face. Up close, Victoria's beauty was terrifying. It was the cold, flawless beauty of a marble statue designed to look down on the world. "Because you forgot your place." "Clara," Victoria whispered softly, her tone sickeningly calm. "You scrubbed that ice yesterday, and you bled. And yet you never looked at me with the respect I demand. You possess this quiet, infuriating arrogance. You think that because you work hard, you are somehow entitled to a victory. You thought you could sneak a fortune out of this estate right under my nose and play the hero for your pathetic little brother." Victoria leaned in closer, the smell of cigarette smoke and mint overwhelming Clara's senses. "I needed to remind you exactly what you are. You are nothing. You own nothing. You love nothing without my permission. And the moment you try to step out of the mud, I will crush you back down into it. Consider the cancelled surgery a lesson in humility." Clara's vision swam with red. A primal violent rage surged through her veins, overpowering the exhaustion. For a split second, She thought about wrapping her bleeding hands around Victoria's perfect throat and squeezing until the cruel light faded from those icy eyes. She thought about destroying the monster standing in front of her, but Victoria saw the flash of rebellion in Clara's eyes, and her smile only widened. "Do it," Victoria whispered, a dangerous, thrilling edge to her voice. "Raise a hand to me. There are 2 armed guards standing at the top of the stairs. If you touch me, I will have you arrested for aggravated assault. You will spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and your crippled brother will be thrown into the foster system by midnight. I dare you. Clara, strike me." The rage in Clara's chest hit a solid, impenetrable wall of reality. She was trapped in a cage made of money and power. Victoria held all the keys, and Leo's life was the collateral. Clara let out a broken, ragged breath, her shoulders collapsing inward. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, echoing void. She lowered her head, surrendering entirely to the monster. "Please," Clara begged, the words scraping against her throat like glass. "Please, Miss Sterling, punish me. Fire me. Make me scrub the floors until my bones break. But please, let the hospital do the surgery. He's just a boy." "Oh, Clara, it's far too late for begging," Victoria sighed, sounding almost bored. She turned away from Clara and began casually inspecting the tiny room. Her eyes scanned the meager possessions, the frayed blanket, the single change of uniform. Then her gaze landed on a small, worn cardboard shoebox tucked halfway beneath the mattress. Before Clara could react, Victoria reached down and pulled the box out. "No, please. Don't touch that," Clara gasped, stepping forward, terror flashing in her eyes. "Those are just personal papers. Please," Victoria's eyes gleamed. She knew exactly what a desperate tone sounded like. She opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded Juilliard acceptance letters, was a thick stack of yellowed, fragile parchment paper. It was handwritten sheet music. The ink was faded, the margins filled with frantic, passionate scribbles and musical notations. "Well, well, well," Victoria murmured, lifting the stack of parchment. "What is this? Are we harboring a secret maestro in the basement?" "It belonged to my mother," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking, her hands reaching out in a desperate, trembling gesture. "She wrote those before she died. It's the only thing I have left of her. Her original compositions. Please, Miss Sterling, put it down. I'll do anything." Victoria looked at the sheet music, then looked at Clara. She saw the absolute, naked desperation in the maid's eyes. This was not just paper. This was Clara's soul, her history. The last remaining tether to a life of beauty and dignity she had been forced to abandon. "Anything," Victoria repeated, echoing her words from the day before. She looked toward the small, cast-iron heating stove in the corner of the room, which burned brightly with a fresh load of coal to keep the freezing basement temperature at bay. Clara realized what Victoria was looking at. Her heart stopped. "No, no, Victoria. Please, God." "No," Victoria didn't hesitate. With a swift, casual flick of her wrist, she tossed the entire stack of brittle, yellowed sheet music directly onto the open flames of the iron stove. "No," Clara screamed, lunging forward. But she was too late. The dry parchment caught fire instantly. A massive burst of orange flame erupted within the stove. Clara felt her knees before the iron grate, thrusting her bandaged hands toward the fire, desperately trying to pull the papers out. But the heat was too intense, driving her back. She could only watch in absolute, paralyzing horror as the ink curled and melted, as her mother's life's work, the beautiful, haunting melodies that had defined her childhood, were reduced to blackened, crumbling ash in a matter of seconds. Victoria stood above her, watching the flames reflect in Clara's shattered, weeping eyes. She felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The rebellion had been extinguished. The maid had been broken. "Clean up this mess before your evening shift," Victoria said coldly, stepping over Clara's kneeling form. She walked out of the room, the sharp click of her heels fading down the concrete hallway, leaving Clara alone in the suffocating silence. Clara remained on her knees in front of the stove. The flames had died down, leaving nothing but glowing red embers and a pile of gray dust. She was entirely empty. The $45,000 was a joke. Her brother was doomed. Her mother's legacy was gone. The world had systematically stripped her of everything she loved, piece by agonizing piece. She reached out with a trembling hand, ignoring the searing heat, and gently touched the pile of ashes. A sound escaped her lips. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a soft, broken hum. Her mind, fractured by the trauma and desperately seeking a psychological anchor to prevent a total collapse, retreated to the only safe place it knew. She began to hum the melody of the sheet music that had just burned. It was a dark, sorrowful lullaby, a complex arrangement of minor chords that spoke of grief, endurance, and the tragic beauty of survival. She hummed it quietly, her voice trembling, rocking back and forth on her heels on the dirty concrete floor, sweeping the ashes together with her bleeding fingers. In the dim hallway outside her open door, a tall, imposing figure materialized from the shadows. Dominic Thorne had just returned to the estate, after a brutal, bloody afternoon securing his territory at the docks. His dark suit was immaculate, but the energy radiating from him was volatile and dangerous. He was walking toward the subterranean armory when the faint, haunting sound of the humming reached his ears. He stopped dead in his tracks. The melody was not something one heard on the radio. It was a highly specific, complex classical composition. But more importantly, it was a melody Dominic knew. He knew it in his bones. It was the exact lullaby his own mother had hummed to him 30 years ago, in a dingy, freezing servant's room much like this one, right before she had worked herself to death to pay off his father's debts. It was a ghost from his past, a sound he had spent decades trying to bury beneath a mountain of money and violence. Slowly, almost against his will, the mafia boss stepped silently toward the open doorway of Clara's room. He stood in the shadows, unobserved. Looking down at the young woman kneeling in the dirt, he saw the gray maid's uniform. He saw the brutally bandaged hands covered in soot. He saw the glowing embers of the stove. And he heard the heartbreaking, undeniable grief pouring from her lips through the melody of his mother for the past 2 years. Dominic had seen Clara Vance simply as part of the estate's background architecture, a quiet, efficient ghost who kept her head down, but in that exact moment, watching her weep over the ashes of a burned dream, the icy, impenetrable fortress around Dominic Thorne's heart cracked. He didn't see a maid anymore. He saw a mirrored soul. He saw a survivor crushed by the same elite machinery that had destroyed his own childhood. Dominic did not step into the room. He did not offer her comfort. To show pity in the underworld was to show weakness. Instead, he simply stood there in the darkness, listening to the lullaby until the final, tragic note faded into silence. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek, his gray eyes darkening into a storm of terrifying, quiet resolve. When Dominic finally turned and walked away into the shadows, the silence he left behind was no longer empty. It was heavily loaded, carrying the weight of an impending reckoning. The elite of the Thorne estate believed they were invincible, but they were entirely unaware that by burning a maid's fragile dream, they had just awoken the monster sleeping in their own house. The Thorne estate did not simply host parties. It staged imperial conquests. By dawn of the gala, the sprawling stone fortress had been entirely transformed, shedding its grim, militaristic atmosphere to masquerade as a palace of high society elegance. Armies of florists rushed through the grand halls, carrying massive, cascading arrangements of white orchids and blood-red roses, their sweet, heavy fragrance masking lingering scent of Cuban cigars and secrets. Caterers in pristine white coats polished crystal flutes until they caught the morning light like diamonds, while the estate's domestic staff worked at a frantic, terrified pace under the dictatorial oversight of Victoria Sterling. But beneath the velvet drapes and the glittering chandeliers, the true nature of the estate remained entirely intact. The men standing at the grand archways and patrolling the perimeter were not standard valet attendants. They wore bespoke, perfectly tailored tuxedos, but the precise, rigid way they stood, and the slight, unnatural bulges beneath their left lapels, gave them away. They were Dominic Thorne's soldiers, heavily armed and hyper-vigilant, ensuring that this gathering of city's legitimate and illegitimate elite remained tightly under the boss's absolute control. For Victoria, this gala was the crowning achievement of her social climbing, a meticulously calculated chess move designed to cement her reign over the city. She intended to show the old money billionaires, the corrupt politicians, and the ruthless syndicate bosses that she was the undisputed queen of the underworld's most powerful empire. But beyond the political maneuvering and the display of obscene wealth, Victoria harbored a secondary, deeply personal agenda for the evening. Her mind kept drifting back to the dingy basement, to the sight of Clara Vance weeping over the ashes of her mother's sheet music. Victoria had broken the maid's spirit. Yes, but simply breaking Clara was no longer enough. Victoria wanted to completely obliterate her. She wanted to drag that quiet, stoic dignity out into the blinding light of the ballroom and slaughter it in front of an audience. She wanted Clara to know, with visceral, undeniable finality, that the gap between a servant and a master was an ocean she would drown in if she ever dared to swim. To execute this, Victoria micromanaged every detail of the grand ballroom's layout. She ordered the massive, custom-made Stein's grand piano and instrument worth over $200,000. Boasting a flawless ebony finish and acoustics designed for concert halls, moved from its usual alcove directly into the dead center of the room. She positioned it directly beneath the largest crystal chandelier, ensuring that whoever sat at that bench would be bathed in an inescapable pool of brilliant, blinding light. The head housekeeper had questioned the bizarre placement, noting that it disrupted the flow of the waitstaff. But Victoria had merely offered a cold, venomous smile and told her to follow orders. Down in the subterranean depths of the estate, Clara Vance prepared for the evening shift like a soldier preparing for a suicide mission. The physical agony in her raw, blistered hands was excruciating, but it paled in comparison to the vast, echoing emptiness inside her chest. The $45,000 sitting in her bank account was a cruel phantom, a worthless string of digital numbers that could not buy her brother's salvation. The ashes of her mother's music were still smeared across her knees. She felt hollowed out, stripped of everything that made her human. When she looked in the mirror above the rusted sink, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her dark eyes were completely void of light, her skin pale and translucent. She meticulously pinned her dark hair back, slipped into her freshly pressed gray uniform, and carefully wrapped her wounded hands in fresh, thin layers of white medical tape. Praying the pain would not cause her to drop a tray during the service, Thomas, the elderly head butler, had tried to intervene. He had cornered Clara in the kitchens, his lined face tight with worry, and ordered her to stay in the back rooms, far away from the main floor. He had offered to assign her to the dishwashing stations, out of Victoria's sight. But before Clara could accept the small mercy, Victoria's personal assistant had marched into the kitchen with a clipboard and a smirk. "Miss Vance," the assistant had announced loudly, ensuring all the staff heard. "Miss Sterling has personally requested your presence on the main floor tonight. You are assigned to serve champagne in the central ballroom, specifically around the piano area. She expects flawless service. If you fail to meet her expectations, you will be terminated immediately." Thomas had stiffened, his jaw clenching with silent fury, recognizing the trap instantly. But he was powerless to countermand a direct order from the future lady of the house. Clara had simply nodded her head, her face an unreadable mask of stone, and picked up her heavy silver tray. By 8 o'clock, the gala was in full swing, and the atmosphere was electric with the dangerous, intoxicating collision of high society and the criminal underworld. The room was a sea of glittering couture gowns, millions of dollars in diamonds, and the low, murmuring hum of conversations that could shift the city's economy or order a man's execution. Dominic Thorne stood near the grand fireplace, a dark, imposing silhouette holding a glass of scotch. He did not mingle aggressively. He didn't have to. The power brokers of the city gravitated toward him, drawn by the terrifying gravity of his influence. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that highlighted his broad shoulders and lethal grace. His gray eyes scanning the room with the cold, calculating precision of an apex predator. Among the arriving guests was a woman whose presence commanded a different kind of reverence. Maestro Evelyn Carmichael walked into the ballroom with the quiet, undeniable authority of a living legend, nearing 70. She wore a simple, elegant black evening gown, her silver hair pulled back into a sophisticated twist. She was not a billionaire, nor was she affiliated with the mafia, but in the realm of the arts. Her word was absolute law. She had conducted the greatest orchestras in Paris, Vienna, and New York. She possessed an ear so discerning it was rumored she could hear a single violinist fall out of tune in a 70-piece symphony. Victoria had spent a small fortune securing the maestro's attendance, donating heavily to her conservatory, all to cast a veneer of high-class culture over the evening's blood-soaked funding. As the evening progressed, Clara navigated the crowded ballroom like a phantom. Her feet ached, and her bandaged hands throbbed violently with the weight of the heavy silver tray. But she moved with a fluid, invisible grace, ensuring crystal flutes were filled without ever making eye contact with the masters of the universe. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, ignoring the mocking glances and the casual cruelty of the elite guests who treated her like an animated piece of furniture. She poured champagne for men who laughed about hostile corporate takeovers, and she offered napkins to women who wore the cost of her brother's surgery on a single finger. She endured it all by retreating deep into her own mind, locking her soul away in a dark, quiet box where Victoria Sterling could not reach it. At exactly 10 o'clock, Victoria set her masterpiece in motion. The hired entertainment for the evening, a renowned classical pianist flown in specifically for the event, was seated at the Steinway in the center of the room. He was currently reviewing his complex sheet music, preparing for the featured performance of the night. The ballroom was beginning to quiet down in anticipation. Victoria, holding a full glass of dark, heavy red wine, glided gracefully across the floor toward the piano. Her emerald silk gown trailed behind her like a serpent's tail. She flashed a brilliant, manufactured smile at the guests she passed, exuding the perfect image of a gracious hostess. As she reached the piano, Victoria leaned in, pretending to admire the intricate sheet music resting on the stand. "It looks incredibly difficult," Victoria purred, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "It is a complex arrangement, Miss Sterling," the pianist replied with a polite, professional smile. "A challenging piece, but quite beautiful. I am so looking forward to it," Victoria said. Then, with a fluid, deliberate, and entirely calculated motion of her wrist, she tilted her crystal glass. The dark red wine cascaded directly onto the pristine sheet music, splashing over the pages and dripping heavily onto the pristine ivory keys of the $200,000 Steinway. The pianist gasped, leaping back from the bench in horror as the wine soaked into his precious, irreplaceable musical arrangements, rendering the notes completely illegible. "My God, the music," he cried, scrambling to dab at the keys with his pocket square. Victoria's gracious smile instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, theatrical fury. She took a step back, feigning shock and indignation. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp enough to cut glass, echoing through the quiet ballroom. "Did you just knock my glass out of my hand?" "What? No, Miss Sterling. I didn't touch you. You spilled. Are you accusing me of lying?" Victoria interrupted, her voice rising, drawing the attention of the entire room. The low hum of conversation ceased completely. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the center of the ballroom. Even Dominic, standing by the fireplace, turned his head, his gray eyes narrowing as he observed his fiancée's sudden outburst. "You are not only clumsy enough to ruin a priceless instrument, But you possess the audacity to blame the hostess. You arrogant, incompetent fool. Miss Sterling, I swear to you, the music is ruined. I cannot perform the featured piece without the arrangement, the pianist stammered, his face pale with panic as the armed security guards in tuxedos took a subtle step forward. Then you are entirely useless to me, Victoria declared, her voice ringing out with cruel, absolute finality. Pack up your ruined papers and get out of my house. You are fired, and you will not see a single cent of your fee. Security escort him off the premises immediately. The pianist, humiliated and terrified of the armed men closing in on him, didn't dare argue further. He hastily gathered his soaked sheet music and practically ran from the ballroom, leaving the grand Steinway sitting empty and stained under the glaring chandelier. The ballroom was completely silent, the guests exchanging uncomfortable, thrilled whispers at the sudden display of ruthless power. Victoria stood victorious beside the piano. She had perfectly manufactured a crisis, a sudden vacuum of entertainment that demanded a solution. She took a slow, deep breath, relishing the absolute attention of the city's elite. Then she turned her head slowly, her icy blue eyes scanning the perimeter of the room. She bypassed the billionaires, the politicians, and the mafia bosses. Her gaze sliced through the crowd like a hunting blade, searching the shadows, until she found exactly what she was looking for. Clara Vance was standing at the edge of the light, her back straight, her trembling, bandaged hands gripping the edges of a silver tray. Victoria's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile. The trap was set. The stage was empty. The victim was cornered, and the execution was about to begin. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Thorne estate was a living, breathing entity. It was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the electric, predatory anticipation of the elite crowd. These were people who thrived on blood sport, whether it was dismantling a rival corporation, ordering a hit on the docks, or watching the social slaughter of an inferior. Victoria Sterling knew her audience intimately, and she knew exactly how to feed them. Standing in the center of the room, directly beneath the blazing crystal chandelier, Victoria let the tension stretch until it was nearly unbearable. The empty Steinway grand piano loomed beside her, a magnificent beast waiting for a master. Victoria smoothed the emerald silk of her gown, her posture radiating absolute, venomous confidence. She picked up a microphone from the nearby podium, her eyes never leaving the quiet, stoic figure of the maid standing in the shadows. Ladies and gentlemen. Victoria's voice echoed through the massive hall, smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor. I must apologize for that unfortunate disruption. It seems true talent is becoming increasingly difficult to purchase these days. People overstate their worth. They forget their station, and they crumble under the pressure of true excellence. A low murmur of agreeable chuckles rippled through the crowd. In the front row of the gathered guests, Maestro Evelyn Carmichael narrowed her eyes, her seasoned instincts detecting the malicious theatricality in Victoria's tone. Near the fireplace, Dominic Thorne remained perfectly still, his face an impenetrable fortress of stone. But his knuckles, gripping the edge of his crystal Scotch glass, had turned entirely white. He knew Victoria was playing a dangerous, cruel game, and his dark, terrifying intellect was already piecing together the target. However, Victoria continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the light, pointing her manicured finger directly at the perimeter of the room. I believe we have a hidden prodigy right here among the domestic staff. A young woman who apparently harbors grand delusions of grandeur beneath her little gray apron. Every head in the ballroom turned, hundreds of eyes calculating, amused, indifferent swiveled to follow Victoria's pointing finger, landing squarely on Clara Vance. Clara stood frozen. The heavy silver tray in her hands felt as though it had turned to lead. The agonizing throb in her bandaged fingers was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, paralyzing terror that washed over her entire body. She felt the weight of the billionaires, the mafia enforcers, and the society wives crushing down on her. She wanted the marble floor to crack open and swallow her whole. She lowered her head, instinct demanding she submit. Demanding she shrink into the nothingness they expected of her. Step forward, Clara, Victoria commanded, her voice dropping its false sweetness, ringing with the sharp crack of a whip, when Clara did not immediately move. Two of the massive security guards in tuxedos stepped up behind her, their sheer physical presence forcing her forward. Clara walked slowly into the blinding light of the chandelier, her cheap black work shoes squeaking faintly against the polished stone. She stopped a few feet away from Victoria, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, her chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. "You cease, ladies and gentlemen," Victoria addressed the crowd, a cruel, mocking smile playing on her lips. "This maid has a habit of forgetting her place. She thinks she is special. She thinks she is entitled to things that do not belong to her. She even harbors the audacity to believe she possesses a refined, artistic soul." Victoria let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "I caught her once, sneaking around the piano in the dead of night, touching the keys as if she actually knew what to do with them. It was quite pathetic, really. Like a stray dog trying to eat at a dining table." The crowd chuckled again. It was a soft, polite laughter, the kind of laughter that sliced deeper than any screamed insult. It was the sound of absolute, institutionalized contempt. Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the familiar metallic tang of blood. She thought of her mother's sheet music, reduced to gray ash in the basement stove. She thought of her brother, Leo, lying in a sterile hospital bed, bravely accepting a lifetime of paralysis because the woman standing in front of her had ordered it so. A dark, heavy pressure began to build in Clara's chest. It was not fear anymore. It was something else. It was the slow, terrifying ignition of a soul that had been pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. "So, I have decided to provide our ambitious little servant with an opportunity," Victoria announced, turning her full, predatory gaze onto Clara. She reached into the bodice of her gown and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper, with a dramatic flourish. She snapped it open. It was a certified cashier's check. "I am holding a check for $10,000. That is more money than this girl sees in a year of scrubbing our toilets." Victoria took a step closer to Clara, lowering the microphone slightly so her next words carried a brutal, intimate threat. "Here is the challenge, Clara," Victoria said, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "If you can sit at that piano right now, in front of all these people, and play a piece of music better than I can, I will hand you this $10,000. But Victoria paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every word landed like a hammer blow. "If you cannot play, or if you make a fool of yourself, you are fired. Immediately. Without your back pay. Without a reference. And your crippled little brother will be out on the freezing street by morning." The ballroom went dead silent. The casual amusement faded from the faces of the guests, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable shock. This was no longer a light-hearted humiliation. It was a public execution. Victoria was explicitly threatening the life of a disabled child for her own entertainment. In the crowd, Maestro Evelyn Carmichael let out a soft gasp of horror, her hand flying to her mouth. By the fireplace, Dominic Thorne's jaw locked. The glass in his hand let out a faint, perilous crack. The ice inside his chest, the fortress he had maintained for years, was beginning to violently fracture. He looked at Clara, standing so small and broken in the center of the room, and he saw his own mother. He saw the helpless agony of the working class being ground into dust by the elite. He prepared to step forward, to unleash the full, terrifying authority of his empire and end this nightmare. But before Dominic could move, Clara lifted her head. The submission was gone. The terror was gone. When Clara looked directly into Victoria Sterling's eyes, there were no tears. There was only a profound, bottomless calm. A terrifying stillness that made Victoria's cruel smile falter for a fraction of a second. Clara did not say a word to the heiress. She simply turned to the side and walked over to a small, ornate side table. With slow, deliberate precision, she set her heavy silver tray down. The clinking of the crystal glasses against the silver sounded like a bell tolling. In the silent room, then Clara reached behind her back. Her raw, heavily bandaged fingers fumbled slightly with the knot. But she pulled the strings of her gray servant's apron. The fabric came loose. She pulled the apron over her head, folded it meticulously, and laid it next to the tray. She was no longer wearing the uniform of a maid. She was wearing a simple, faded black dress. But the way she held her shoulders, the elegant, unyielding line of her spine, transformed her entirely. She did not look like a servant. She looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. Clara turned and walked toward the $200,000 Steinway. A ripple of genuine shock ran through the crowd. Whispers broke out among the billionaires and the mafia bosses. Is she actually going to do it? The maid, with those bandaged hands. Victoria stood frozen, her eyes wide with a sudden, creeping anxiety. This was not how the script was supposed to go. Claire was supposed to fall to her knees. She was supposed to beg for her job, cry, to provide Victoria with the ultimate visual of shattered pride. Instead, Clara was walking toward the piano with the grim, magnificent purpose of a martyr. Clara reached the bench. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Dominic or Victoria. She looked down at the pristine ivory keys, stained slightly with the red wine Victoria had spilled. She reached out with her heavily taped, bleeding fingers and gently traced the edge of the wood. The instrument was beautiful. It was a vessel of creation, a bridge to the divine, currently trapped in a house of monsters. Slowly, Clara sat down on the bench. She adjusted her posture, planting her feet firmly on the pedals, straightening her back, aligning her arms with the precise, flawless mechanics drilled into her by the masters at Juilliard a lifetime ago. She closed her eyes. She thought of the ashes in the basement stove. She thought of her mother's thin, frail hands guiding her own when she was just a child. She thought of Leo, lying in the sterile hospital bed, smiling bravely as his future was stolen from him. The pain in her hands was agonizing, a searing fire burning through her nerves. But she welcomed it. She harnessed it. She gathered every ounce of grief, every swallowed insult, every freezing hour on the icy driveway, and every broken dream she had ever harbored. And she channeled it down through her arms, into her battered fingertips. Before she struck the first chord, Clara opened her eyes. She did not look at Victoria. She looked out at the sea of billionaires, at the corrupt politicians, at the men who thought they owned the world because they held the money and the guns. Her voice was not loud, but in the absolute, deathly silence of the ballroom, it carried with the clear, piercing resonance of a silver bell. You believe that because you hold the power. You own the beauty in this world, Clara said, her words slicing through the suffocating arrogance of the Thorne estate. But art does not belong to the wealthy. It does not belong to the cruel. Art belongs to the broken. Because we are the only ones who know what it costs to survive. She turned her eyes back to the keys. She raised her scarred, bandaged hands, hovering them over the ivory for one final, breathless second. And then, Clara Vance brought her hands down, and the world shattered. The first note did not merely ring through the grand ballroom of the Thorne estate. It shattered the suffocating, arrogant silence like a diamond cutting through glass. When Clara Vance's bandaged fingers struck the ivory, the acoustic perfection of the $200,000 Steinway projected the sound with a staggering, physical weight. It was a heavy, resonant minor chord, striking deep into the chest of every billionaire, socialite, and syndicate enforcers present. For a fraction of a second, the crowd simply blinked, their champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths, unable to process the profound auditory assault originating from the frail, battered woman sitting in the center of the blinding chandelier light. And then, before the reverberation of the first chord could fade, Clara's hands began to move. They moved with a ferocious, blinding velocity, a mechanical impossibility for hands wrapped in bloody medical tape, yet driven by an agonizing, transcendent grief that defied all physical limitations. She did not play a polite, classical sonata. She played a tempest, It was an impossibly complex, unrecorded masterpiece composed by her late mother, a symphony of suffering and endurance that Clara had kept locked inside her soul for over a decade. The melody surged like a violent ocean storm, characterized by thunderous, crashing bass notes that shook the crystal glasses on the silver trays, intertwined with a frantic, delicate treble that wept like a starved child in the snow. Clara's eyes remained tightly closed, her face pale and damp with exertion. She was no longer in the Thorn estate. She was transported back to the freezing basement, watching her mother cough blood into a rag. She was kneeling on the treacherous, icy driveway, scrubbing the cobblestones until her skin tore. She was standing in the sterile hospital room, looking into her 12-year-old brother's terrified eyes as he bravely accepted a lifetime of paralysis. Every ounce of her rage, every tear she had ever swallowed in the name of survival, poured out through the blood, seeping through her bandages, and staining the pristine white keys. The physical toll on her body was horrific, yet she felt no pain. She was entirely consumed by the divine, terrible fire of creation. In the front row of the gathered elite, Maestro Evelyn Carmichael sat entirely paralyzed, the legendary conductor. A woman who had spent half a century dissecting the greatest performances on earth felt a hot, involuntary tear spill over her eyelashes, carving a path through her expensive makeup. Evelyn recognized instantly that she was not witnessing mere technical proficiency. She was witnessing a raw, bleeding human soul being laid bare on the ivory. Beside her, the sneering, arrogant faces of the city's most ruthless power brokers slackened into expressions of profound, uncomfortable awe. The music bypassed their wealth, their titles, and their cruelty, striking directly at the primal, buried humanity they had long since traded for power. But it was Dominic Thorne who underwent the most violent internal metamorphosis, standing near the grand fireplace. The undisputed king of the criminal underworld stared at Clara with wide, unblinking gray eyes. The fortress of ice he had meticulously constructed around his heart over the past 20 years, the very armor that allowed him to order executions and dismantle empires without a second thought, was systematically dismantled by the melody. The music gripped him by the throat, dragging him back to the smell of cheap laundry soap and the sound of his own mother's exhausted breathing. He saw with blinding clarity the absolute majesty of Clara's resilience. She was not a maid. She was a warrior who had survived a war fought entirely in the shadows, armed with nothing but her own unyielding dignity. In that singular, breathtaking moment, Dominic Thorne realized that he had spent his entire life accumulating power. Yet the most powerful force in the room was the broken woman sitting at the piano. As Clara's performance reached its devastating crescendo, the music spiraled upward in a desperate, soaring plea, climbing higher and higher before finally crashing down into a single, fragile, echoing final note. The note hung in the air, a beautiful, tragic ghost, slowly dissolving into the absolute, deathly silence of the ballroom. Clara kept her hands resting lightly on the stained keys, her head bowed, her chest heaving with exhaustion. A single drop of blood fell from her taped knuckle, splashing silently onto the polished ebony wood for 10 agonizing seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The ballroom was trapped in a state of collective paralysis. The elite crowd entirely shell-shocked by the emotional violence they had just experienced. And then Maestro Evelyn Carmichael slowly rose to her feet. The elderly woman brought her hands together, clapping with a fierce, deliberate reverence. The sound broke the spell. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. Billionaires, politicians, and mafia enforcers surged to their feet, delivering a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. The applause was a roaring physical wave, shaking the very foundations of the estate. Clara slowly opened her eyes. Turning her head to look at the crowd, she saw the tears in the maestro's eyes. She saw the genuine, unfiltered awe on the faces of the people who had mocked her only minutes before. A profound, blinding ray of hope pierced through Clara's exhausted mind. I did it, she thought. her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. I won $10,000. It's not enough for the surgery, but it's a start. It's leverage. Leo is going to be okay. The overwhelming, intoxicating illusion of false security wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She had beaten the system. She had proven her worth. My necklace. The shriek was sharp, hysterical, and entirely calculated, slicing through the thunderous applause like a butcher's blade. The clapping abruptly faltered, dying out in a chaotic wave of confusion as all eyes whipped toward Victoria Sterling. The billionaire's fiancé was standing a few feet away from the piano, her hands frantically clutching her bare collarbone. Her face was twisted into a mask of theatrical, hyperventilating panic. My necklace, Victoria screamed again, her voice vibrating with artificial terror. The Sterling family diamond. It's gone. Someone has stolen it. The atmosphere in the ballroom instantaneously inverted, plunging from transcendent awe into a paranoid, dangerous hostility. The armed security guards in bespoke tuxedos immediately reached into their jackets, stepping forward to form a defensive perimeter around the exits. The elite guests instinctively checked their own jewelry, stepping away from one another, their eyes darting around the room in suspicion. Lock the doors, Victoria ordered, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the head of security. No one leaves this room. That diamond is worth $500,000, and it was around my neck 5 minutes ago. Clara remained seated on the piano bench, the warm blanket of hope instantly turning to ice in her veins. She watched Victoria's performance with a sickening, dread-filled intuition. Victoria did not look like a woman who had just lost a priceless family heirloom. Beneath the exaggerated panic, Clara could see the cold, reptilian gleam of triumph in the heiress's icy blue eyes. Search the staff, Victoria commanded, her gaze slowly, deliberately panning across the room until it locked directly onto Clara. Search the girl. She is a desperate, poverty-stricken rat who has been begging me for money all week. She took off her apron and walked right past me before she sat down. Miss Sterling, that is a baseless accusation, Maestro Evelyn Carmichael interjected, her voice trembling with indignation as she stepped forward to defend Clara. This young woman just delivered a performance of divine proportions. She has been sitting at the piano in full view of this entire room. She is a thief, Victoria spat, dropping all pretense of elegance, revealing snarled predator beneath the silk gown. Guards, check her apron, the one she so conveniently discarded on the tray. 2 massive security enforcers converged on the small silver tray resting on the side table. One of them roughly snatched up the folded gray apron Clara had taken off moments before. He shook the fabric violently. A heavy glittering object flew from the deep front pocket of the apron, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, expensive clatter. The Sterling family diamond necklace lay perfectly illuminated under the chandelier, sparkling with damning, irrefutable evidence. A collective gasp of horror and disgust ripped through the crowd. The billionaires and socialites immediately recoiled, their faces contorting with absolute contempt. The awe they had felt seconds ago was instantly erased, replaced by the comforting, familiar prejudice they held against the working class. Of course she is a thief. Their whispers seemed to hiss through the air. They are all the same, animals in uniform. No, Clara gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she stood up from the piano bench, her legs trembling violently. No, I didn't touch it. I didn't take anything. She put it there. She set me up. Grab her, Victoria shrieked, pointing a triumphant finger at Clara. The 2 guards lunged forward. They did not treat her like a woman. They treated her like a violent threat. One guard grabbed Clara by the shoulder, spinning her around with brutal force, while the others seized her bandaged hands, twisting her arms painfully behind her back. Clara cried out in agony as the fresh scabs on her knuckles ripped open, fresh blood soaking rapidly through the white tape. The guard produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, snapping them brutally around her delicate wrists. The cold, biting metal locked securely into place, effectively sealing her doom. You vile, ungrateful creature, Victoria hissed, walking slowly toward Clara, her emerald silk gown swishing ominously against the marble. She stopped inches from Clara's face, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You actually thought you could humiliate me. You thought you could sit at my piano and win. I warned you. Clara, I told you I would crush you back into the mud. Victoria turned to face the shocked crowd, transforming her viciousness back into the posture of a victimized hostess. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this horrifying display of criminal behavior. This maid is terminated immediately, without a single cent of compensation. Furthermore, she will face the absolute maximum penalty of the law. Victoria snapped her fingers, looking at the head of security. Call Captain Reynolds at the 14th precinct. He is on my father's payroll. Tell him I want this thief charged with grand larceny. Ensure she is denied bail. I want her rotting in a federal penitentiary for the next 15 years. 15 years. The words hit Clara like a physical execution. Her knees buckled, her body sagging entirely against the brutal grip of the guards holding her arms. She was going to prison. She would be locked in a cage, stripped of her name, her future, and her freedom. But the true, apocalyptic horror was not her own incarceration. The true horror was the realization of what her absence would mean. Please, Clara begged, tears streaming down her pale, terrified face. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the billionaires, the politicians, the women draped in diamonds. Please, someone, listen to me. I didn't steal it. If I go to jail, my brother has no one. He's 12 years old. He's in a wheelchair. He'll die without me. Please, the elite crowd looked away. They inspected their champagne flutes. They whispered to their spouses. They stared at the intricate patterns of the ceiling architecture. They were entirely insulated by their wealth, completely immune to the desperate, agonizing screams of a peasant. Their indifference was a weapon far deadlier than any gun in the room. Suddenly, a violent commotion erupted at the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. Thomas, the elderly head butler, burst into the room. He was no longer maintaining his rigid, professional composure. His face was ash-white, his chest heaving with panicked exertion. And he was holding Clara's cheap prepaid cell phone tightly in his trembling hand. He ignored the armed guards, sprinting directly across the ballroom floor toward Clara. Clara, Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with a devastation that made the blood freeze in Clara's veins. Thomas, what is it? Step away from the prisoner, Thomas, Victoria demanded. Stepping into his path, Thomas bypassed Victoria completely, shoving past the heiress with a shocking display of insubordination. He reached Clara, holding the phone up. The screen was illuminated, displaying an active call on speakerphone. Clara, Thomas choked out, tears spilling down his lined face. It's the hospital. It's about Leo. Clara stopped struggling. The air in her lungs evaporated. Leo, is he okay? What happened to his spine? From the speaker of the cheap cell phone, a cold, bureaucratic, and entirely unsympathetic female voice echoed through the silent ballroom. Is this Clara Vance? The voice asked. This is Agent Miller with Child Protective Services. We are currently on site at the city hospital regarding your dependent brother, Leo Vance. We have been informed by the hospital administration, acting on a tip from the 14th Police Precinct, that you are currently being taken into police custody for felony grand larceny. No, Clara whimpered, violently shaking her head, the heavy steel handcuffs rattling loudly. No, please. I'm right here. I'm coming to get him. As an incarcerated individual, you are legally deemed an unfit guardian, the CPS agent continued, her voice devoid of any human empathy. Your brother is currently being discharged from medical care due to lack of funding and parental supervision. He is being remanded into state custody. We are transferring him to the emergency foster care processing facility immediately. Do not attempt to contact the hospital further. An appointed state attorney will contact you regarding the severance of your guardianship rights. The phone line clicked dead. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most catastrophic silence Clara Vance had ever experienced. It was the sound of her universe imploding, collapsing inward into a black hole of absolute, irredeemable despair. Victoria Sterling had not merely stolen Clara's freedom. She had orchestrated the systematic, clinical destruction of Clara's entire reason for existing. Leo, her sweet, brave 12-year-old brother, was being ripped from his hospital bed, thrown into a government van, and tossed into the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the foster system, while his spine slowly deteriorated into permanent paralysis. Clara's legs gave out completely. The guards holding her arms grunted, struggling to hold up her dead weight as she collapsed toward the marble floor. "Well," Victoria said softly, a sickening smile stretching across her face as she looked down at Clara's broken form. "It seems the trash is finally being taken out." Guards drag her through the service elevator. "I don't want her filth contaminating the main foyer. Get her out of my sight." The trap had snapped shut with flawless, lethal precision. The masterpiece had been played. The massacre had been executed. And the heiress stood triumphant over the ashes of the maid's life. There is a specific, terrifying psychological threshold that a human being crosses when they have truly lost everything. It is a boundary located far past the realms of panic, beyond the frantic borders of bargaining, and deep into the suffocating abyss of absolute surrender, when a person is stripped of their future, their freedom, and the people they love. The mind ceases to fight. It shuts down, retreating into a dark, hollow void to protect itself from the lethal overdose of agony. As Clara Vance's knees struck the freezing marble floor of the grand ballroom, she crossed that threshold. She knelt there, a crumpled, defeated silhouette bathed in the blinding light of the crystal chandelier, her bloody hands bound tightly behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs, the pain in her torn knuckles, the agonizing strain on her shoulder joints from the awkward angle of the restraints, meant absolutely nothing. Her body was a meaningless vessel. Her soul was already gone, riding in the back of a state-owned van with a terrified, crippled 12-year-old boy who was crying out for a sister who would never come. "Get her up," one of the massive security guards growled, his thick fingers digging brutally into her bicep as he attempted to haul her back to her feet. Clara did not resist, nor did she assist him. She was dead weight, her head hanging limply forward, her dark hair falling in a tangled curtain over her pale, tear-stained face. She allowed herself to be dragged upright, her cheap black work shoes scraping uselessly against the polished stone. She slowly lifted her head, her hollow, deadened eyes scanning the perimeter of the room one final time. She was completely surrounded by the most powerful entities in the city. There were men in this room who could eradicate a federal lawsuit with a single phone call. There were women whose diamond earrings cost more than the emergency spinal surgery that could have saved her brother's legs. She looked at them, not with anger, but with a profound, crushing realization of the world's inherent, institutionalized cruelty. "Please," Clara whispered. The word barely had any sound. It was a fragile, raspy breath escaping her cracked lips. She did not look at Victoria. She looked at a billionaire shipping magnate standing nearby, a man who had clapped the loudest during her performance. "Please, I don't care about the police. I don't care about prison. Just call the hospital. Just pay for his surgery. He is 12 years old. He paints mountains. Please don't let them put him in the system. I will plead guilty to whatever you want. Just save Leo." The shipping magnate blinked, visibly uncomfortable. He adjusted his silk tie, cleared his throat, and deliberately turned his back on her. Suddenly fascinated by a conversation with his wife, Clara's gaze drifted to Maestro Evelyn Carmichael. The elderly conductor was weeping openly, her hands covering her mouth in horror, but she remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the terrifying authority of the armed men and the mafia ecosystem she had foolishly stepped into. She offered Clara her tears, but tears could not buy a child's freedom. "Disgusting," Victoria Sterling scoffed, rolling her eyes as she took a sip from a fresh glass of champagne. "Even in handcuffs, You are still begging for a handout. It's a genetic flaw with you people. Take her away. Now the smell of desperation is ruining my appetite. The two guards tightened their grip, violently jerking Clara backward. They began to drag her across the grand ballroom, hauling her toward the dark, shadowed archway that led to the subterranean service elevators. Clara's feet dragged lifelessly behind her. She watched the glittering chandelier recede into the distance. She watched the elite crowd part like the Red Sea, eagerly stepping out of the way to avoid the contamination of her presence. She had reached rock bottom. The dark, suffocating mud Victoria had promised her had finally swallowed her whole. Clara closed her eyes, preparing to vanish into the permanent darkness of the penal system, preparing to spend the rest of her miserable life mourning the boy she had failed to protect. Clink, the sound was microscopic. In a normal environment, it would have been entirely imperceptible. But in the hushed, tense silence of the Thorne Estate ballroom, it cut through the air with the devastating precision of a sniper's bullet. It was the sound of heavy, solid silver striking pure marble. Clink. The two massive security guards dragging Clara instantly froze. They did not slow down. Their bodies locked up with a violent, instantaneous physiological reaction. Their heavy combat boots halted mid-step. The grip on Clara's arms did not loosen, but it turned entirely rigid. Clara opened her eyes, confused by the sudden halt. She looked up, at the far end of the ballroom. Standing on the elevated marble landing of the grand staircase was Dominic Thorne. He had not shouted. He had not drawn the heavy, custom-made firearm holstered beneath his midnight blue tuxedo jacket. He had simply stepped out of the shadows, resting his hand casually on the intricately carved marble banister. On his right index finger, he wore a massive, antique silver signet ring, the undeniable, blood-soaked crest of the Thorne Syndicate. He had tapped it against the stone twice. The entire ballroom underwent a terrifying, instantaneous atmospheric shift. The air pressure in the room seemed to violently plummet, sucking the oxygen from the lungs of every billionaire, politician, and socialite present. The polite, uncomfortable murmurs ceased completely. The armed men guarding the exits instinctively straightened their spines, their hands dropping away from their concealed weapons in a universal display of absolute submission. Dominic Thorne was no longer the quiet, imposing host standing by the fireplace. He had unleashed his aura, projecting the raw, unadulterated menace of an apex predator who had just locked the doors to the slaughterhouse. His face was a mask of terrifying, glacial fury. The muscles in his jaw ticked with lethal tension, and his cold, storm-gray eyes were locked directly onto the two guards holding Clara. "Let her go," Dominic said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, dark, gravelly command that did not ask for compliance. It demanded it at the threat of immediate execution. The sound of his voice sent a visceral shudder down the spines of everyone in the room. The two guards did not hesitate for a microsecond. The terror in their eyes was primal. They instantly released Clara's arms, stepping back so quickly they nearly tripped over one another, putting as much distance between themselves and the prisoner as physically possible. Unsupported, Clara swayed dangerously, her bound hands unable to catch her balance, and she fell heavily onto her side against the cold marble floor. Victoria Sterling's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged spike of genuine confusion and rising panic. She whipped around, staring up at her fiancé on the landing. "Dominic, what on earth are you doing?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill, attempting to assert her authority over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "This maid is a convicted thief. She stole the Sterling family diamond from my neck. The police are already on their way. I gave the guards a direct order to remove her from the premises." Dominic did not look at Victoria. He did not acknowledge her existence. It was as if she were a buzzing insect entirely unworthy of his attention. He kept his terrifying gaze fixed on the floor, watching Clara struggle to push herself up into a kneeling position with her bloody, handcuffed wrists. Slowly, deliberately, Dominic began to descend the grand staircase. Each step he took echoed through the silent ballroom with the heavy, rhythmic finality of a ticking time bomb. The crowd instinctively shrank back, parting wider and wider to clear a path for the mafia boss. They recognized the lethal intent radiating from his body. They recognized that the rules of high society had just been violently suspended, replaced by the dark, unforgiving laws of the underworld. "Dominic," Victoria shouted, her panic mutating into desperation as she rushed forward, attempting to intercept him at the bottom of the stairs. "Did you not hear me? She is a criminal. She humiliated me, and she stole from my family. You cannot countermand my orders in front of these people. I am your fiancé." Dominic reached the bottom of the stairs. He finally turned his head, locking his glacial eyes onto Victoria. The look he gave her was devoid of anger, devoid of affection, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. It was the look a butcher gives a slab of meat before bringing the cleaver down. Victoria froze in her tracks, the breath catching in her throat, every instinct screaming at her to back away. "You," Dominic whispered, his voice so cold it practically frosted the air between them, "are nothing but a liability." Victoria recoiled as if she had been physically struck, her face draining of all color. Dominic bypassed her completely, walking directly into the center of the ballroom, stepping into the blinding light of the crystal chandelier. He stopped in front of Clara Vance. Clara knelt on the floor, looking up at the towering silhouette of the mafia boss. Her mind, fractured by grief and exhaustion, could not process what was happening. She expected him to draw a weapon, to personally administer the punishment for disrupting his gala. She braced herself, lowering her head, waiting for the final blow. Instead, Dominic did something that sent a shockwave of absolute, incomprehensible horror through the ranks of the elite crowd. The undisputed king of the city's underworld, a man whose tailored suits cost more than the average citizen made in a decade, slowly bent his knees. He crouched down on the marble floor, bringing himself perfectly level with the bleeding, handcuffed maid. Up close, Clara could see the faint, faded scars on his jawline. She could smell the dark cedarwood and the expensive scotch on his breath, but more importantly, when she looked into his terrifying gray eyes, she did not see a monster. She saw a man who was looking at her with a profound, searing intensity. A man who had recognized his own reflection in the shattered pieces of her soul. Dominic reached out. He did not touch her face or offer empty comfort. He grabbed the heavy steel chain connecting her handcuffs. His massive, scarred hand wrapped around the metal, testing the tensile strength. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto the head of security standing paralyzed near the exits. "Bring me the keys," Dominic commanded, the lethal quiet of his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Bring me the keys right now, or I will peel the skin from your bones." The head of security practically tripped over his own feet in his haste to comply, sprinting across the ballroom, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled for the universal handcuff key on his tactical belt. Clara stared at Dominic, her chest heaving, the tears spilling continuously down her pale cheeks. "Why?" she choked out, her voice a broken, desperate rasps. "Why are you doing this?" "My brother. They took my brother. He's gone. Everything is gone." Dominic looked back at her. The icy fortress surrounding his heart had completely shattered, revealing a dark, violently protective inferno underneath. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency meant only for her ears. "They haven't taken anything yet," Dominic whispered, his words carrying the absolute, immovable certainty of a man who commanded armies. "You survived the ice. Clara, you survived the fire. Now, you are going to let me burn their world to the ground." The head of security arrived, dropping to his knees, his hands trembling violently as he inserted the small metal key into the handcuffs. With two sharp clicks, the heavy steel bracelet sprang open, falling away from Clara's bloody, bandaged wrists. Dominic Thorne stood up, his towering silhouette casting a long, dark shadow over the terrified elite crowd. He reached out, offering his hand to the broken maid kneeling on the floor. The execution had been halted. the rescue had begun. And the Thorne estate was about to witness a massacre of an entirely different kind. In the underworld, loyalty is everything. Blood oaths are carved in the dark, and empires are built on the silent promises made between men who live outside the boundaries of the law. But as Dominic Thorne stood in the center of the blindingly lit ballroom, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his high society gala, he realized that true loyalty had nothing to do with syndicate contracts or territorial treaties. True loyalty was the fierce, unyielding devotion of a sister willing to sacrifice her entire existence for a crippled brother. And Dominic Thorne had just found the one woman on earth worth burning his empire down for. He looked down at Clara Vance. Her wrists were bruised and bleeding, her gray dress stained with sweat and the ashes of her mother's burned legacy. Yet, as she looked up at him, her dark eyes still burned with the desperate, ferocious light of a survivor. Dominic slowly shrugged off his tailored, midnight blue tuxedo jacket. The silk lining rustled in the absolute silence of the room. He stepped forward and gently draped the heavy, warm fabric over Clara's shivering shoulders. The jacket swallowed her small frame, carrying the scent of dark cedarwood and expensive scotch, wrapping her in an undeniable, physical shield of his absolute protection. He did not ask her if she was all right. He knew she was fundamentally broken. Instead, he simply reached down, took her raw, unbandaged hand in his, and pulled her to her feet, placing her directly behind him. Victoria Sterling stood a few feet away, her emerald silk gown suddenly looking less like royal attire and more like a costume she had outgrown. The color had completely drained from her flawlessly contoured face. The triumphant, predatory sneer she had worn just moments ago had dissolved into a mask of chaotic, hyperventilating panic. She looked at Dominic, then at the heavy silver handcuffs lying discarded on the marble floor, and finally at Clara, who was now standing under the direct, terrifying amnesty of the most dangerous man in the city. Dominic, what is the meaning of this? Victoria demanded, her voice cracking, pitching an octave higher as she desperately tried to claw back the narrative. She is a thief. You are humiliating me in front of the entire city. I found my family's diamond in her apron. You all saw it. The guards saw it. She is a criminal. And you are treating her like a victim. You need to step away from her and let the authorities handle this before you ruin our reputation entirely. Dominic did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The lethal, suffocating aura radiating from his tall frame was enough to push the surrounding billionaires and socialites further back into the shadows. He slowly turned his head, fixing his glacial, storm-gray eyes on his fiancée. The look was devoid of any recognizable human empathy. It was the clinical, dead-eyed stare of a predator analyzing a dying insect. Our reputation. Dominic repeated, the words sliding from his lips like broken glass. You speak of reputation, Victoria, while standing in my house, breathing my air, and attempting to use my resources to murder a child's future for your own shallow amusement. You think I do not know exactly what breathes beneath this roof. I don't know what you are talking about, Victoria shrieked, taking a defensive step backward, her hands fluttering nervously toward her bare collarbone. She stole from me. She insulted me. Dominic ignored her frantic protests. He raised his right hand, the heavy silver signet ring catching the light of the chandelier, and snapped his fingers once. Immediately, the massive, crystal chandelier hanging above them dimmed, plunging the center of the ballroom into a tense, dramatic twilight. A low, mechanical whirring sound echoed from the vaulted ceiling. A massive, state-of-the-art projection screen descended smoothly against the far wall of the grand hall. At the back of the room, Dominic's Shadow Ops tech team men, who usually spent their nights encrypting offshore accounts and tracking rival syndicate movements, hacked directly into the estate's internal, highly classified surveillance frame. The projector flared to life, casting a stark, high-definition rectangle of light over the silent, terrified crowd. The video footage on the screen was crystal clear, time-stamped merely an hour prior. It displayed a high angle, unobstructed view of the grand ballroom before the guests had arrived. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the digital version of Victoria Sterling paced around the empty Sesnoiseau piano. They watched as Clara's folded gray apron was set neatly on the silver tray on the side table, and then the entire room watched in irrefutable, horrifying clarity as Victoria reached into the bodice of her emerald gown, pulled out the glittering Sterling family diamond necklace, and swiftly, maliciously shoved it deep into the pocket of Clara's discarded apron. A collective, synchronized gasp ripped through the crowd. The billionaires, the politicians, and the mafia enforcers stared at the screen, the undeniable truth washing away all previous prejudice. But Dominic was not finished. The footage abruptly cut to a different camera angle, this one capturing a secluded, shadowed alcove in the hallway outside the ballroom. The audio kicked in, crisp and damning. It showed Victoria standing with her personal assistant, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated cruelty. Call the 14th precinct. Victoria's recorded voice hissed through the massive surround sound speakers of the ballroom, echoing off the marble walls. Tell Captain Reynolds to arrest the maid for grand larceny, and then call Child Protective Services. Tell them the guardian is being incarcerated. I want that crippled little brother of hers ripped out of the hospital and thrown into the system tonight. I want her to lose everything. The footage cut to black. The chandelier slowly illuminated back to its full, blinding brilliance. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total societal annihilation. The elite crowd recoiled from Victoria as if she had suddenly manifested a highly contagious, lethal disease. The women who had air-kissed her cheek hours ago now looked at her with visceral disgust. The men who had done business with her father calculated the immediate financial necessity of severing all ties. Victoria had not just committed a crime. She had violated the unspoken, sacred boundaries of basic human decency. And she had been caught doing it on the grandest stage possible. Victoria stood entirely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The undeniable, digital proof of her monstrosity had stripped away every layer of her manufactured elegance. She was completely naked before the judgment of the underworld. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and frantic, searching for a single sympathetic face, but the crowd was a wall of cold, unyielding stone. She looked back at Dominic, her knees beginning to tremble. Dominic, please, Victoria whimpered. The venom completely drained from her voice, replaced by the pathetic, whining tone of a cornered rat. It was a mistake. I was angry. She disrespected me. You know how much pressure I've been under with the gala. My father. My father's syndicate will compensate you for the embarrassment. We can fix this. Please, Dominic. We are getting married. Dominic took a slow, measured step toward her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stopped mere inches from her trembling form, towering over her with the absolute, terrifying majesty of a dark king passing judgment. We are not getting married, Victoria, Dominic said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing nearby. Your father's syndicate currently operates out of the southern ports by my grace alone, by midnight tonight. That grace is revoked. I am seizing your family's shipping lanes. I am liquidating your father's assets in the Diamond District. Every politician your family has bought will receive a phone call from my lieutenants, instructing them to forget your name. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. Victoria let out a strangled, breathless sob, her hands flying to her face in absolute horror. You can't do that. You can't just take everything. I am the architect of this city, Dominic whispered coldly. I can take whatever I please. But what I am taking from you is merely paper and metal. What you attempted to take from this woman was her soul. You tried to murder a child's future because you could not stand the fact that a maid in a faded uniform possessed more dignity, more talent, and more humanity in her bleeding hands than you possess in your entire bloodline. Dominic turned slightly. looking at the two massive security guards who had previously dragged Clara across the floor. The guards immediately stiffened, terrified that they were next on the execution block. Strip her of her credentials, Dominic ordered, pointing a steady finger at Victoria. Escort her off my property. She leaves with the clothes on her back and absolutely nothing else. If she ever attempts to cross the city limits, if she ever speaks the name Clara Vance again, you will not call the police. You will call me, and I will handle it personally. The guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They flanked Victoria, grabbing her arms just as brutally as they had grabbed Clara's. Victoria broke down completely, screaming and thrashing, her emerald gown tearing as she fought against the inevitable. Dominic, no. You can't do this to me. I am a Sterling. You are ruining my life. Her hysterical screams echoed down the grand hallway, growing fainter and fainter as she was dragged toward the service elevators, until the heavy metal doors slammed shut, severing her from the world of power forever. The empire she had tried to build had been vaporized in less than 5 minutes. Dominic did not watch her leave. He turned back to Clara. She was standing perfectly still, swallowed by his heavy jacket, her dark eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. The nightmare was over, but the adrenaline crashing in her veins left her shaking violently. Dominic looked past her, making eye contact with Thomas, the elderly head butler, who was still standing nearby, clutching Clara's cell phone. Thomas, Dominic said, his voice losing the lethal edge, softening into a tone of urgent, commanding authority. Yes, Mr. Thorne, Thomas replied, straightening his posture, his eyes shining with profound, unbridled respect for the master he served. Have my private security detail warm up the armored convoy. Call the aviation crew and tell them to ready the helicopter on the south lawn, Dominic instructed, stepping closer to Clara and gently placing his warm, heavy hand on the small of her back to steady her. We are going to the hospital. We are going to get her brother. Clara looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his protection broke the final barrier of her endurance. She let out a soft, fractured sob, her forehead dropping to rest against his chest. Dominic Thorne, the most feared man in the criminal underworld, wrapped his arms around the broken maid, holding her tight against the storm. He closed his eyes, resting his chin gently on the top of her dark hair, silently vowing that the hands that had played the masterpiece would never be forced to bleed for survival again. Scars do not mean you are broken. They are the intricate, beautiful maps of your survival. They are the undeniable proof that when the world attempted to tear you apart, your spirit refused to surrender. For Clara Vance, the scars on her hands would forever serve as a reminder of the freezing ice and the agonizing price of her brother's life. But as she sat in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room of the city's pediatric hospital, those scars were gently cradled in the massive, warm hands of a mafia boss. The journey from the Thorne estate to the hospital had been a blur of tactical precision and absolute power. Dominic's helicopter had bypassed city traffic, landing directly on the hospital's emergency helipad. When Dominic Thorne walked through the sliding glass doors of the pediatric wing, flanked by 4 heavily armed men in black suits, the entire bureaucratic machinery of the hospital ground to a terrifying, immediate halt. The CPS agents, who had been in the process of forcibly transferring Leo onto a gurney, had frozen in absolute terror when Dominic stepped into the room. Dominic did not yell. He simply instructed his men to escort the agents out of the building and promised them that if they ever drafted another document with the name Vance on it, he would personally ensure their respective agencies were defunded into oblivion. Dr. Harrison Sterling, the corrupt chief of medicine, had attempted to bluster his way through the confrontation, citing hospital policy and administrative overrides. Dominic had calmly walked up to the trembling doctor, backed him against the sterile white wall, and quietly informed him that Victoria Sterling's empire was dead. He then produced a digital dossier containing every embezzled dollar and illicit offshore account the chief of medicine possessed. You have exactly 10 minutes to assemble the finest neurological surgical team on the eastern seaboard, Dominic had whispered, his gray eyes piercing the doctor's soul. If that boy loses the ability to use his legs, you will lose the ability to use yours. Do you understand? Leo had been rushed into the operating room moments later, now in the quiet, agonizing hours of the early morning. Clara and Dominic sat alone in the private waiting room. The adrenaline had faded, leaving Clara exhausted and vulnerable. She was still wearing Dominic's heavy tuxedo jacket over her gray uniform. Dominic sat beside her on the stiff leather couch. He had taken off his bow tie, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a crime lord and more like a weary soldier finding peace after a long, brutal war. He held her bandaged hands in his thumbs gently, rhythmically stroking the uninjured skin of her wrists. You didn't have to do all of this, Clara whispered, staring down at their intertwined hands. You could have just fired her. You didn't have to declare war on her family. You didn't have to come here. Dominic was silent for a long time. He looked up at the sterile ceiling, his jaw clenching as he navigated the ghosts of his own past. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he had buried for over 2 decades. When I was 10 years old, my father racked up a massive gambling debt with a rival syndicate. Dominic began, his voice low and raspy. He ran, leaving my mother to pay the price. She was a maid, Clara, just like you. She worked in a massive, sprawling estate for a family of old money billionaires. They knew she was desperate. They knew she was working to keep me safe from the men my father owed. So they worked her to death, literally. They forced her into grueling labor, denied her medical care, and treated her like an animal until her heart finally gave out on the kitchen floor. Clara looked up at him, her eyes as wide with shock and profound, aching sympathy. She saw the raw, bleeding wound beneath the icy exterior of the mafia boss. I sat in a hospital waiting room just like this one, Dominic continued, his gray eyes locking onto hers. I begged the doctors to help her. I begged the billionaires she worked for to pay for her care. They all looked the other way. They let her die because she was poor, and because they could. I promised myself on her grave that I would build an empire so powerful, so terrifying, that no one would ever be able to look the other way again. I became a monster to survive the monsters. He reached up, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind Clara's ear. But tonight, when I heard you play that piano, when I saw you standing in the light, bleeding and broken but completely unyielding, you reminded me of why I built this empire in the first place. I didn't save you. Clara, you saved me. You reminded me that power is utterly worthless if it is not used to protect the people who still have light inside them. Clara leaned forward, her tears falling softly, and pressed her forehead against his. In the quiet sanctuary of the hospital, two shattered souls forged a bond, forged in the fires of shared trauma and undeniable survival. They sat together in the silence, waiting for the dawn, and for the first time in their lives. Neither of them was alone. 6 months later, the atmosphere inside the legendary Carnegie Hall was electric. The grand, historic auditorium was packed to absolute capacity. The audience was a diverse tapestry of life music critics, wealthy patrons, and ordinary citizens drawn by the viral, legendary tale of the prodigy who had risen from the ashes. The golden acoustics of the hall hummed in anticipation of the evening's featured debut. Backstage, Clara Vance stood before a full-length mirror. She was no longer wearing a faded gray maid's uniform. She was dressed in a breathtaking, elegant black velvet gown that swept the floor with quiet majesty. Her dark hair was styled in soft, cascading waves. Her hands, completely healed save for a few faint, silvery scars on her knuckles, rested gently by her sides. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely at peace. Maestro Evelyn Carmichael stepped up behind her, placing a warm, encouraging hand on Clara's shoulder. Evelyn had taken Clara under her wing immediately following the incident at the Thorne estate, providing her with the mentorship and resources necessary to reclaim her rightful place in the world of classical music. "Are you ready, my dear?" Evelyn asked, her eyes shining with maternal pride. "I am, Maestro." Clara smiled, taking a deep, steadying breath. The heavy velvet curtains slowly parted. The audience erupted into a deafening roar of applause as Clara walked onto the stage. The blinding spotlights tracked her graceful movements as she walked toward the magnificent grand piano sitting center stage. But before she sat down on the bench, Clara walked to the edge of the stage, picking up a microphone resting on a stand. The crowd immediately hushed, hanging on her every movement. Clara looked out into the vast sea of faces. She didn't look at the VIP boxes on the upper balconies. Instead, her eyes immediately found the front row of the general admission section. Sitting there, in his wheelchair, was Leo. He was wearing a sharp little tuxedo, his cheeks flushed with healthy color, and his bright eyes shining with unadulterated joy. The surgery had been a flawless success, and while his recovery was ongoing, the threat of paralysis had been permanently eradicated. Sitting directly next to Leo, looking entirely out of place in the general admission seating, but refusing to sit anywhere else, was Dominic Thorne. The mafia boss wore a tailored black suit, his terrifying aura muted by the soft, genuine smile playing on his lips. Resting on his lap was a beautifully bound portfolio containing the restored, transcribed copies of Clara's mother's sheet music. He looked at Clara with a love so profound and absolute it anchored her very soul. Clara gripped the microphone, her voice carrying clear and strong through the historic auditorium. 6 months ago, I was told that my worth was defined by the uniform I wore and the amount of money in my bank account. Clara began, her words echoing into the hearts of thousands. I was told that art, beauty, and dignity were privileges reserved exclusively for the elite. But I learned, through fire and survival, that this is a lie. True power isn't found in the empires you build, the money you hoard, or the people you crush to get there. She looked directly at Dominic, and then down at her brother. True power is found in the hands you reach down to pull others up, Clara declared, her voice ringing with the undeniable truth of a woman who had conquered the darkness. It is found in the fundamental belief that every human being, regardless of their station, has a right to live, to heal, and to be heard. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the ultimate rebellion against a cruel world. The audience sat in stunned, breathless silence, deeply moved by the explicit, powerful integration of her values. Clara smiled, setting the microphone back on its stand. She walked over to the piano bench and sat down. She raised her hands that had scrubbed ice, hands that had bled, hands that had been locked in steel cuffs, and hovered them over the pristine ivory keys. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the stage lights and the boundless, infinite love of the family she had fought so fiercely to protect. And then Clara Vance brought her hands down and played a symphony of absolute, unbreakable healing. Clara Vance's journey from a freezing, blood-stained driveway to the brilliant, golden stage of Carnegie Hall is much more than a dramatic tale of survival. It is a profound testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. When we look at Clara and Dominic, we see two people from entirely different universes, a powerless, desperate maid and a terrifying, untouchable mafia boss. Yet, beneath the bespoke suits and the faded gray uniforms, they were ultimately united by the shared, silent scars of their pasts. Their story reminds us that beneath the velvet gowns, the staggering wealth, and the arrogant facades of the elite, we are all fundamentally human. The Thorne estate was a fortress of cruelty, a place where people like Victoria Sterling believed that dignity was a commodity that could be bought, sold, or burned in a cast-iron stove. But Clara proved that the light carried within a pure soul can never be extinguished by contemptuous words or malicious schemes. She stood with her back straight, proving that true dignity does not lie in shouting back at an insult, but in keeping your grace even when the whole world wants to press you down. As we navigate our own complex lives, the core lesson of this story resonates deeply in today's world. True power is never found in the empires you build, the wealth you hoard, or the people you step on to reach the top. Real, undeniable power is found in the hands you reach down to pull others up from the dark. Dominic Thorne possessed the terrifying ability to dismantle cities and destroy lives with a single whisper. Yet he found his true strength only when he knelt on a cold marble floor to unlock the steel handcuffs of a broken woman. He realized that using his absolute authority to protect the vulnerable rather than oppress them was the ultimate rebellion against a cruel and unjust system. For all of us watching, this serves as a powerful call to examine how we treat those who serve us, those who have less, and those who are fighting invisible battles every single day. The true value of a human being never lies in the position where they stand, the clothes they wear, or the work they do. It lies entirely in the empathy they show and the grace they maintain when the world is actively trying to crush them. Furthermore, this story is a beautiful, cinematic reminder that our scars do not mean we are broken. Clara and Dominic both carried the profound, heavy grief of watching their mothers suffer under the crushing weight of an unfair society. Instead of letting that darkness turn her bitter, Clara channeled her agonizing pain into a symphony of healing that brought an entire room of billionaires to tears. We all carry our own hidden sheet music, our dreams, our buried traumas, and our quiet, fragile hopes. Sometimes, life or cruel individuals will try to burn those dreams to ashes. But the music is never truly gone. It lives inside you, woven into your very survival. You must never let anyone convince you that you do not deserve a seat at the piano of life. You have the fundamental human right to exist fully, to be respected, and to shine brilliantly, no matter where you started or how many times you have been pushed into the mud. Sometimes the very people who are looked down upon and forgotten are the ones carrying the most beautiful gifts inside them, only waiting for one moment to raise their voice and move the whole world. As the final, lingering notes of Clara's masterpiece fade into the silence, we hope her breathtaking courage inspires you to stand tall in your own life, to fiercely protect the vulnerable, and to never apologize for the brilliant light you bring to the dark spaces of this world. May you always remember that compassion is not a weakness, but the strongest armor you can wear. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, true happiness, peace, and serenity in every passing day. This content was researched, built, and edited manually by us to bring meaning and lessons. If Della's story has touched your heart today, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with the people you love so that every day more meaningful stories can be spread and reach even more hearts.